On a quiet, overcast morning, Sarah stepped out of her small cottage just on the outskirts of town. Her well-worn violin case was clutched in her hand, her other hand adjusting a shawl over her shoulders as the early morning breeze nipped at her skin. For anyone watching, it would seem like a regular start to the day for this quiet, middle-aged woman. But the weight in her steps and the subtle tremble in her hands told a different story. This was no ordinary day, just another of many since she lost her only son, Ben, who'd been her light, her hope, and her reason to live. The small town knew her story all too well, and those who saw her heading toward the cemetery would only shake their heads in quiet sympathy, understanding that she was carrying out her almost daily ritual at Ben's grave. Ben had been gone for almost 2 years now. He was young, just 14, when a car accident took him away from her. He had been walking home from school when a driver, distracted for a split second, drifted off the road and struck him. That single moment of carelessness shattered Sarah's life. Since then, her days had blended into a blur of routines, her life an unending pattern of going through the motions, too numbed by grief to find any joy in the world around her. Ben had been a promising musician, a natural talent who could pull magic from any instrument he touched. The violin had been his favorite, and over time, Sarah had learned to play it herself. After his passing, playing the violin became her way of connecting with him, of keeping his memory alive in a world that seemed so empty without him. As she approached the cemetery, the familiar path seemed unusually eerie in the mist that hung over the gravestones like a heavy shroud. The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the trees, as if whispering secrets only the dead could understand. Sarah felt a strange chill run down her spine. It wasn't unusual for her to feel Ben's presence when she played, but today felt different somehow, as if she were being watched, as if someone, or something, was waiting for her. She shook off the feeling, chiding herself for letting her imagination run wild. Grief could play cruel tricks on the mind, and she knew better than to succumb to them. Setting up by Ben's headstone, Sarah took a deep breath and removed her violin from its case. The instrument had become as much a part of her as her own heart, and she held it with a tenderness that spoke of the memories and sorrow it represented. She began to play, her fingers dancing over the strings, coaxing a hauntingly beautiful melody into the still morning air. This was the song Ben had loved most, a piece he had often played in their small living room, filling their home with a warmth that now existed only in her memories. As she played, her eyes drifted close, and she allowed herself to get lost in the music, in the memory of her son's laughter, his joy, his life. Each note was a heartbeat, a whisper of the love she still carried for him. But today, something was different. Even through the notes, she felt a presence near her, as if someone had silently appeared without disturbing a single blade of grass. She opened her eyes slowly, and there, just a few yards away, stood a boy about Ben's age. He was watching her with a soft, almost knowing look in his eyes, his expression one of gentle curiosity mixed with a sadness she recognized immediately. He didn't belong to anyone she knew, and she was certain she'd never seen him before in town. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She tried to continue playing, but her hands began to tremble, and her bow slipped, cutting off the melody abruptly. The boy stepped forward, seemingly unfazed by her reaction. As he drew closer, Sarah could see him more clearly, a young face with an air of wisdom beyond his years, his clothes a little too big for his small frame, his shoes slightly worn. There was a familiarity about him, something almost otherworldly, and yet she couldn't place it. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft and low. "That song, it reminds me of someone I lost too." The words were so unexpected, so gently spoken, that Sarah felt the weight of them hit her like a blow. For a moment, she was too stunned to respond. She looked at him, searching his eyes, trying to understand what he meant. There was no way this child could know the song's significance, no reason he would recognize it or feel anything for it. And yet, the way he looked at her, as if he understood her grief, as if he shared it, unnerved her. Who did you lose?" She finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy looked down for a moment, a shadow passing over his face. "My little sister," he murmured. "She loved the violin. She used to play for me, just like you're playing now." Sarah felt her heart break a little at his words. She could see the pain in his eyes, a pain so similar to her own that it was almost unbearable. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand hovering uncertainly before she let it drop. I'm so sorry," she whispered, feeling an overwhelming urge to comfort this strange child, to protect him somehow. "It's a beautiful instrument," she added, her voice trembling. "It connects us to those we've lost." The boy nodded, looking at the violin with a quiet reverence. "She used to say the same thing. She said that every time she played, she felt closer to me, even if we were apart. That's why I come here sometimes, to listen." His gaze drifted to the headstone, and Sarah realized with a shock that he was looking directly at Ben's name, as if he knew exactly whose grave he was standing beside. A shiver ran down her spine. How could he know? She hadn't mentioned Ben, hadn't told him why she was here, but there was something in the boy's gaze, something almost uncanny, that made her feel as if he understood her pain in a way no one else ever had. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Did you know him?" The boy didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked back at her, his eyes filled with a sorrow so deep that it seemed to echo her own. "I know what it's like to miss someone so much it hurts," he said softly, "to feel like they're still with you, even when they're gone." His words were like a balm to her wounded heart, and yet they stirred a sense of unease within her. There was something otherworldly about this child, something that felt both comforting and unsettling. They stood in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts, their own memories. Finally, the boy looked up at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Do you think they can hear us when we play for them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She had asked herself the same question so many times, wondering if Ben could somehow hear her, if he knew how much she still loved him, still missed him. I hope so," she replied, her voice breaking. "I want to believe that they can." The boy nodded, a small sad smile playing on his lips. "Then I think they can," he said quietly. "I think they're always with us, even if we can't see them." And with that, he turned and began to walk away, leaving Sarah standing by Ben's grave, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She wanted to call out to him, to ask him to stay, to understand who he was and why he seemed to know her pain so intimately. But somehow, she knew he wouldn't answer. She watched him until he disappeared into the mist, leaving her alone once more. As she stood there, a strange sense of peace washed over her. The boy's words echoed in her mind, filling her with a hope she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps, she thought, Ben was still with her, watching over her, listening to her music. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had thought. And for the first time since he passed, Sarah felt a glimmer of something she had almost forgotten. Comfort and a small, fragile belief that her son might still be near, listening to her song. The morning after her encounter with the strange boy, Sarah awoke with an unshakable feeling of restlessness. She couldn't get the boy's face out of her mind. The sorrow in his eyes, the way he spoke as if he understood her pain exactly, and that haunting, uncanny familiarity he had with Ben's song, as if he, too, were bound to it by an invisible thread. All day, she found herself glancing at the violin resting in its case by the window, half expecting to see him there, watching, waiting. But each time she looked, there was only the empty yard, the sound of wind whispering through the trees. By late afternoon, she could no longer resist the pull to return to the cemetery. She told herself it was just for her own peace of mind, just to shake off this lingering sense of mystery. But deep down, Sarah knew she was hoping to see the boy again, hoping he would somehow appear and make sense of this strange connection they seemed to share. Her heart raced with a mix of apprehension and anticipation as she grabbed her violin and headed down the path, retracing the steps she had taken countless times before. As she approached the cemetery, she felt a strange energy in the air, a sort of quiet expectancy. The light was dimming, casting long shadows across the gravestones, and an eerie silence blanketed the area, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the grounds, searching for any sign of him. But the cemetery appeared empty, deserted. Disappointment pricked at her, but she pushed it aside, chiding herself for hoping to see him again. She reached Ben's grave, setting her violin down as she knelt by the headstone. Running her fingers over his name, she felt the familiar ache in her chest, the ache that had become her constant companion since the accident. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and allowed herself a moment of quiet solitude, letting the memories wash over her. After a few minutes, she picked up her violin, preparing to play. Perhaps, she thought, the music would bring her some sense of peace, some relief from the unanswered questions that haunted her. But as she lifted the bow to the strings, a voice broke the silence, soft yet clear as a bell. "You came back." Sarah's heart leaped, and she spun around, her eyes widening as she saw the boy standing a few paces away, his face illuminated by the dim glow of twilight. He was watching her with that same knowing look, his gaze steady and unblinking. She felt a strange mixture of relief and fear, as if she had been expecting him all along but still couldn't quite believe he was real. I didn't expect to see you again," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Why not? I told you I come here sometimes." Sarah swallowed, trying to steady her racing heart. She wanted to ask him so many things, to understand who he was and how he knew about Ben's song. But the words caught in her throat, and all she could manage was a soft, "Who are you?" The boy's smile faded, and he looked down, his expression suddenly guarded. "Just someone who lost someone too," he murmured. "Someone who understands." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, something he wasn't telling her. She hesitated, then asked, "Did you know my son, Ben?" The boy looked up, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, he said nothing, and Sarah could almost feel the weight of his silence, as if he were grappling with something too profound to put into words. Finally, he nodded, barely perceptible, but enough to make Sarah's heart skip a beat. "Yes," he said quietly. "In a way, I think I did." Her breath caught, and she felt a rush of emotions, hope, confusion, disbelief, all swirling together in a chaotic whirl. "How?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How could you know him?" The boy hesitated, glancing away as if he were searching for the right words. "Sometimes people leave behind pieces of themselves," he said slowly. "Pieces that stay with us, even when they're gone. I think I carry a part of him with me." Sarah stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. It was as if he were speaking in riddles, each sentence layered with hidden meanings. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The boy met her gaze again, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed far too deep for someone so young. "Ben and we were connected," he said softly. "Not in a way you'd understand, maybe. But I feel him, sometimes, like he's still here, watching over us." A chill ran down Sarah's spine, and she felt a strange, almost otherworldly sensation wash over her. She didn't know what to make of his words, but something about them resonated with her, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. It was as if he had tapped into a truth she had always known but never dared to voice. She looked down, her hands shaking as she clutched her violin. "You remind me of him," she said softly, almost to herself. "The way you talk, the things you say, it's like you knew him, like you understand him." The boy nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe that's because I do," he said quietly. "Maybe that's why I come here. To feel close to him, and to you." A lump formed in Sarah's throat, and she felt her eyes filling with tears. She had spent so many lonely days, so many nights questioning, wondering if Ben was still with her in some way, if he could see her, if he knew how much she missed him. And now, here was this boy, this mysterious, hauntingly familiar boy, telling her things she had only ever dared to hope. She took a shaky breath, trying to gather her thoughts. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy hesitated, then looked down, as if reluctant to answer. "Daniel," he said finally, his voice soft and almost hesitant, as if he were revealing something sacred. Sarah nodded, the name feeling both foreign and familiar on her tongue. "Daniel," she repeated, letting the sound linger in the air. She looked at him, studying his face, searching for something, anything, that might explain this strange connection they seemed to share. They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their unspoken understanding hanging heavy between them. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Would you play the song again? The one you were playing yesterday?" Sarah felt a surge of emotion, a warmth that spread through her chest and brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. She nodded, lifting her violin and positioning it against her shoulder. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play, letting the haunting melody fill the air, each note carrying with it the weight of her love, her grief, her longing. As she played, she felt Daniel's presence beside her, a quiet strength that steadied her trembling hands and gave her the courage to pour her heart into the music. She didn't know why, but she felt as if she were playing not just for Ben, but for Daniel as well, as if this melody were a bridge connecting them all, a thread that bound their lives together in a way she couldn't fully understand. When she finished, she opened her eyes, her heart pounding, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Daniel was watching her, his eyes glistening with tears. He took a step closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," he said softly, "for bringing him back, even if it's just for a moment." Sarah felt her heart twist, a mixture of joy and sorrow, so intense that she could barely breathe. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his shoulder, a silent gesture of comfort, of understanding. They stood there in the fading light, two souls bound together by loss, by love, by a connection that transcended time and space. In that moment, Sarah realized that she wasn't alone, that even in her darkest moments, Ben's spirit lived on, not just in her memories, but in the people he had touched, the lives he had changed, the love he had left behind. And perhaps, she thought, Daniel was part of that legacy, a living testament to the impact her son had on the world. As they parted ways that evening, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet assurance that Ben was still with her, still watching over her. She knew she would see Daniel again, and that their connection was only just beginning to unfold. And for the first time since Ben's death, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, delicate hope that reminded her that love, in all its forms, never truly dies. The days after her second encounter with Daniel drifted by in a haze, leaving Sarah to sift through a maze of emotions she could barely untangle. She found herself going back to the cemetery every evening, not necessarily to play the violin, but simply to feel close to Ben, and perhaps to feel the presence of the boy who had, in some strange way, reignited the small flicker of life within her that she thought had been extinguished forever. Daniel had become a mystery she felt compelled to understand. He seemed to know her grief, to share in it, and that was a bond deeper than she had ever felt with anyone else since Ben's passing. She wondered about him constantly, where he came from, how he knew so much, and what truly connected him to Ben. True to his word, Daniel started appearing at the cemetery with increasing frequency. Sometimes he would arrive just as she did, a quiet figure slipping into the scene as though he belonged there, while other times she would look up to find him already there, standing by Ben's grave in respectful silence. They rarely spoke, yet there was an understanding between them that felt as tangible as any conversation. The townspeople began to notice too. Sarah's late afternoon walks to the cemetery were no secret, and she had become something of a quiet legend in the small town. Neighbors, storekeepers, and friends exchanged whispers and sidelong glances, wondering about the boy who had appeared so suddenly and so mysteriously. One afternoon, as Sarah walked through the town square on her way to the cemetery, she noticed a few familiar faces watching her with raised eyebrows. Mrs. Gleason, the town baker, leaned over to her friend and whispered something, her eyes darting towards Sarah with a mix of pity and concern. Sarah felt a pang of embarrassment and quickly looked away, but she could feel the weight of their stares even as she hurried past. People had always been sympathetic to her, and she knew they meant no harm, but now there was something different in their looks, a kind of skepticism or worry that she couldn't ignore. She began to wonder if they thought she was losing her mind, if they saw Daniel as a figment of her grief-fueled imagination. When she reached the cemetery that evening, Daniel was already there, standing near Ben's grave, his hands tucked into his pockets as he gazed down at the headstone. Sarah approached him quietly, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and nervousness. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Daniel, have you noticed people looking at us differently? It's like they don't understand." Daniel looked up, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "They probably don't," he said gently. "People don't always understand things that don't make sense to them." There was a hint of sadness in his voice, and Sarah felt a pang of sympathy. She wondered if he, too, had felt the sting of being misunderstood, of feeling out of place. She took a deep breath, deciding to be honest with him. I think some people believe I'm imagining things, that I'm just seeing what I want to see because I miss Ben so much." Her voice trembled, and she looked down, feeling a surge of vulnerability. "Sometimes I wonder if they're right. If maybe I've just invented you, that you're some part of my mind's way of coping with the pain." For a long moment, Daniel was silent, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart ache. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice low and earnest. "Sarah, you're not imagining me. I'm real, and so is everything we shared here." His words were firm, yet laced with a gentleness that reassured her, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I'm here because I feel a connection, too. Because I feel like Ben, like he's somehow a part of both of us." There was a truth in his words that Sarah couldn't deny, even if she couldn't fully understand it. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence, solid and real. In that moment, all of her doubts faded, replaced by a quiet certainty that this boy, mysterious as he was as real as the grief she carried, as real as the love she still held for Ben. But the townspeople's curiosity grew, and with it, their skepticism. Sarah's visits with Daniel became something of a local spectacle. People began to linger near the cemetery, pretending to pass by as they tried to catch a glimpse of the strange, quiet boy who had captured Sarah's attention. Some even murmured that Daniel was a bad influence, a distraction that prevented her from moving on, from healing in the way they thought she should. Others believed he was a figment of her grief-stricken mind, an imaginary companion born of a mother's desperation. Rumors spread, and soon Sarah's friends and family grew concerned too. Her sister, Evelyn, approached her one afternoon with a look of thinly veiled worry. "Sarah," Evelyn began, her voice low and hesitant, "I know you're grieving, and I know you feel close to Ben in a way I'll never understand. But people are starting to talk. They say you've become obsessed, that you're losing yourself to something that isn't real." She paused, looking at her sister with a mixture of love and apprehension. "I don't want to see you get hurt." Sarah listened in silence, a storm of emotions churning within her. She knew Evelyn was coming from a place of love, that she was only worried about her, but the implication that Daniel wasn't real, that he was just some figment of her imagination, cut deep. She took a shaky breath, struggling to find the words to defend herself, to make Evelyn understand. But how could she explain something that even she didn't fully comprehend? "Evelyn, he's real," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I don't know why or how, but he's real. And somehow, he knows things about Ben that he shouldn't. Things that only I would know. It's like he's connected to Ben in a way that I can't explain." Evelyn looked at her, her brow furrowing in concern. "Sarah, I want to believe you. I do. But it doesn't make sense. Maybe it's a way for you to hold on to Ben, to keep him alive in your heart. But I don't want you to lose yourself to something that isn't real." The words stung, and Sarah felt a flash of anger mixed with sorrow. She loved her sister dearly, but in that moment, she felt more alone than ever. She knew Daniel was real, knew that what they shared was real, but explaining it to someone who hadn't experienced it, who hadn't felt that unexplainable connection, was like trying to capture the wind in her hands. She turned away, feeling the weight of her grief and her frustration pressing down on her. In the following days, Sarah felt the pressure from the townspeople intensify. Friends stopped by unannounced, offering her gentle advice on how to move on, how to let go of the past. Well-meaning neighbors brought her books on healing and closure, each gift a subtle reminder of their belief that she was clinging to an illusion. She felt as if she were being torn in two. On one side, the love and understanding she felt with Daniel, a bond that felt as real as any she had ever known, and on the other, the judgment and disbelief of the people around her, the people who believed she was losing herself to something intangible. But Daniel remained a steady presence, visiting her at the cemetery with quiet assurance, offering her a sense of peace and companionship that she hadn't known in years. One evening, as they sat by Ben's grave in the fading light, Daniel broke the silence, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "Sarah, I know it's hard," he said gently. "I know people don't understand, but I think Ben brought us together for a reason. Maybe it's to help each other, to remind each other that we're not alone." His words struck a chord deep within her, resonating with a truth she had always felt, but never dared to believe. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at him, feeling a surge of gratitude for this strange, beautiful connection they shared. I think you're right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're the first person who's made me feel alive again. Like there's a part of Ben that's still here, still with us." They sat in silence, their hands intertwined as they gazed at the headstone, feeling the presence of something greater than themselves, a love that transcended time and space. For the first time since Ben's passing, Sarah felt a sense of hope, a fragile, delicate hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to move forward without letting go. As the weeks went by, the townspeople's skepticism slowly transformed into a quiet curiosity. They watched as Sarah and Daniel continued their silent rituals at the cemetery, their bond unshaken by the whispers and doubts of the world around them. Slowly, people began to see the change in Sarah, a light in her eyes, the strength in her voice, and they started to understand, in their own way, that perhaps there was more to life and death than they could ever truly comprehend. And while some would always doubt, others began to believe. As the connection between Sarah and Daniel deepened, so did the divide within the small town. The townspeople's reactions became a blend of fascination, unease, and judgment. Some saw Sarah's relationship with Daniel as a beautiful but tragic story of a mother finding solace, while others whispered that it was unhealthy, maybe even a sign that Sarah was slipping further into grief. The rumor mill spun faster, with locals speculating about who Daniel really was, where he came from, and why he seemed so drawn to Sarah. It didn't help that Daniel seemed to come and go as quietly as the mist, slipping into town like a shadow and vanishing just as quickly, as if he existed only in the space between Sarah's grief and her hope. One autumn afternoon, Sarah was at the local grocery store when she overheard two women in the aisle beside her speaking in hushed tones. They were talking about her, but their words were edged with a sense of pity that stung more than outright criticism ever could. "Poor Sarah," one of the women whispered. It's been years since Ben passed, but she still can't seem to move on. Now there's that boy, Daniel, and the way she talks about him. It's like she thinks he's some kind of miracle. The other woman sighed. I know, it's heartbreaking. I mean, it's clear she's attached to him. But sometimes I wonder if he's really good for her. I can't help but feel he's taking advantage of her. She's vulnerable, after all. Sarah froze, feeling a flush of anger rise in her chest. The words taking advantage echoed in her mind, twisting her stomach into knots. She wanted to march around the corner, to confront them, to make them understand that Daniel wasn't just some random boy. But she knew it would only confirm their suspicions, only fuel the rumors that she was becoming unhinged. With a heavy heart, she quietly left her cart behind and walked out of the store, the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her like a leaden cloak. As she made her way to the cemetery that evening, Sarah's thoughts were a whirlwind of frustration, sorrow, and doubt. She knew that her relationship with Daniel was unconventional, that others couldn't understand the bond they shared. But to hear people imply that Daniel might be taking advantage of her vulnerability, it hurt more than she could bear. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to survive even the worst pain life could throw at her. And yet here she was, feeling as though she were losing her grip on reality, questioning the very thing that had given her a sense of purpose again. When she arrived at the cemetery, Daniel was waiting by Ben's grave, his hands in his pockets, his face lit by the last rays of the setting sun. He looked up as she approached, his expression softening as he noticed the turmoil in her eyes. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle but concerned. She hesitated, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "People, they don't understand. They think I'm imagining things. They think that you're taking advantage of me." Her voice cracked, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek. "It's like they don't want to believe that this connection we have is real. They see it as some delusion, something I've made up because I'm too broken to let go." Daniel's face tightened, a flicker of pain crossing his eyes. He took a step closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, you know that's not true. You know that what we share, it's real. I may not be able to explain it, but I feel it just as deeply as you do." His voice was steady, filled with an earnestness that eased her doubts, if only for a moment. She looked up at him, her heart heavy with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I know," she murmured. "I feel it too. But sometimes it's hard to hold on to that when everyone around me is questioning my sanity, when they look at me like I'm broken." Daniel's grip on her shoulder tightened, his gaze intense. "Then let them question. Let them think what they want. They don't know what you've been through, Sarah. They don't know the pain you carry, the love you still hold for Ben." He paused, his voice softening. "And they don't understand that sometimes love doesn't end just because someone is gone. Sometimes it finds a way to stay with us, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else." His words wrapped around her like a balm, soothing the ache in her heart. She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her tears. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace, a reassurance that she wasn't losing herself, that perhaps she was finding something even more profound, something that defied the limits of understanding. But the scrutiny from the town continued to grow, and soon it began to reach beyond whispers. One evening, as Sarah and Daniel were leaving the cemetery, they encountered a small group of townspeople gathered by the gate. Among them were some of the same faces that had once greeted her with warmth and understanding. Neighbors, old friends, people who had shared in her grief when Ben passed. But now, their expressions were a mix of pity, concern, and even suspicion. "Sarah," called Mr. Finch, an elderly man who had known her family for years, "we just want to talk. We're worried about you. This relationship you have with this boy, it's not normal. It's not healthy. You're clinging to something that isn't real." Sarah felt a surge of anger and fear rise within her, but before she could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his gaze unwavering as he faced the group. "With all due respect, you don't understand," he said firmly. "You don't know what Sarah has been through, and you don't know what this connection means to her, or to me. Sometimes, people come into our lives for reasons we can't explain, and maybe it doesn't make sense to you, but it's real to us." A murmur ran through the group, some of them exchanging uneasy glances, while others looked at Daniel with something approaching sympathy. But Mr. Finch shook his head, his expression hardening. "Son, grief can make people see things that aren't there. We just want Sarah to heal, to move on. And it seems like your presence here is keeping her stuck in the past." Daniel's face softened, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored Sarah's own. "I'm not here to keep her in the past. I'm here because we both needed something that only the other could understand. I lost someone too. And I know what it feels like to need that connection, to feel like there's a part of them still with you." His voice broke slightly, and he looked down, his hands clenching into fists. "Maybe it doesn't make sense, but it's what we both need right now. And if you can't understand that, then maybe it's not Sarah who needs to change. Maybe it's how you see grief, how you see love." His words hung in the air, resonating with a power that seemed to silence the group. For a long moment, no one spoke, each of them grappling with the truth of what he had said. Finally, Mr. Finch nodded, a reluctant respect in his eyes. "Well, I suppose we all have our own ways of grieving. I just hope you know what you're doing, Sarah." With that, the group slowly dispersed, leaving Sarah and Daniel standing alone in the fading light. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, but also a lingering sense of sorrow, a realization that she had crossed a threshold that she couldn't go back from. The town would never see her the same way again, and she would always be the woman who clung to a boy from nowhere, a boy who seemed to embody the love and loss she carried. That night, as they sat by Ben's grave, Daniel turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Sarah, I think it's time I told you something. Something I haven't been able to put into words until now." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I feel like I was meant to find you. Like Ben guided me here. I don't know why or how, but I feel his presence every time I'm with you, every time we're here." Sarah's heart pounded, a mixture of awe and disbelief filling her chest. "What do you mean?" Daniel looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I think Ben wanted us to meet. I think he wanted you to have someone who could understand, who could carry his memory with you. And maybe I needed you too. Because of what I lost, because of the emptiness I carry." His voice was filled with a sincerity that made her believe, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, this strange, beautiful connection they shared was something beyond explanation, something that transcended the limits of life and death. In that moment, Sarah felt a sense of peace, a realization that she wasn't alone, that Ben was still with her, in a way she hadn't been able to see before. She reached out, taking Daniel's hand, and they sat there in silence, two souls bound together by love, by loss, and by a connection that defied the boundaries of the living and the dead. The townspeople would never understand, and maybe they didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, Sarah felt a change within herself, a new strength she hadn't known since Ben's passing. It was as if a weight had been lifted, one that she had carried for so long that she had forgotten what life without it felt like. She continued to visit the cemetery every evening, and Daniel was always there, waiting with a quiet, unwavering presence that had become her anchor. But even as she found solace in their connection, an unspoken tension lingered between them, a feeling that their time together was drawing to a close. It was in the way Daniel's gaze would linger on her a bit longer, or how his voice would soften with a bittersweet undertone, as if he, too, felt the approach of an inevitable farewell. One late autumn evening, Sarah arrived at the cemetery to find Daniel already waiting by Ben's grave, his face solemn and his hands tucked into his pockets. The air was thick with an unspoken emotion, and Sarah's heart raced as she approached him, sensing that tonight would be different. There was a strange intensity in his gaze, a mixture of sorrow and resolve that unsettled her. "Daniel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is something wrong?" He looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening as he seemed to struggle with his words. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something I've been meaning to say for a while now." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I have to leave soon." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. "Leave," she echoed, her voice shaking. "But why? Where will you go?" Daniel's gaze softened, and he took a step closer, reaching out to take her hands in his. "I don't know exactly where," he admitted, "but I know it's time. I came here for a reason, to be with you, to share in your grief, and to help you find peace. But I think that purpose has been fulfilled." Sarah shook her head, her grip tightening on his hands as if holding him could somehow keep him from slipping away. "No, Daniel, please, don't go. I'm not ready to say goodbye. I finally feel like I'm not alone anymore. There are others who need me, other people who might be going through what we did." He paused, his voice barely a whisper. "And I think Ben would want that." The mention of her son's name made her heart ache, but it also brought a strange sense of comfort. She had always felt that Ben's spirit was somehow connected to Daniel, that her son had guided him to her in a time when she needed him most. And now, as she looked into Daniel's eyes, she could see that same kindness, that same selfless love that Ben had carried with him. She knew, deep down, that he was right, that he had come into her life for a purpose, and that purpose had been fulfilled. But letting go was harder than anything she had ever imagined. They stood in silence for a long time, the fading light casting long shadows across the cemetery as the weight of their farewell settled between them. Finally, Sarah took a shaky breath, forcing herself to speak. "Will I ever see you again?" Daniel's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Maybe. But even if you don't, I'll always be with you, in here." He placed a hand over her heart, his gaze filled with a warmth that made her feel as if he were leaving a piece of himself with her, a part of his spirit that would stay by her side even after he was gone. With a final, lingering look, Daniel turned and began to walk away, his figure fading into the mist that had begun to settle over the cemetery. Sarah watched him go, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude, knowing that she was saying goodbye to more than just a friend. She was saying goodbye to a part of herself, to the grief and pain that had defined her for so long. And in its place, she felt a quiet peace, a sense of closure that she had thought was impossible. In the days that followed, Sarah returned to the cemetery, but Daniel was nowhere to be found. She searched for him, calling out his name, hoping that he would appear just once more, that she would see his familiar figure waiting by Ben's grave. But he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. And yet, in the quiet stillness of the cemetery, in the gentle rustling of the leaves, and the soft whispers of the wind, she felt his presence, a comforting reminder that he was still with her in spirit. The townspeople noticed the change in her too. They watched as Sarah went about her days with a newfound strength, a quiet resilience that radiated from her like a beacon. She no longer walked with the weight of grief hanging over her, no longer carried the hollow look of someone lost in the past. Instead, there was a calm serenity in her eyes, a sense of peace that the townspeople couldn't quite understand. And though they still whispered and wondered about the strange boy who had appeared and vanished like a phantom, they could see that his presence had left an indelible mark on her heart, a gift that she carried with her wherever she went. One evening, as she sat by Ben's grave, her violin resting on her lap, Sarah felt a strange urge to play. She lifted the instrument, positioning it against her shoulder, and began to play Ben's favorite melody, her fingers gliding over the strings with a grace she hadn't felt in years. The music filled the air, a hauntingly beautiful sound that seemed to echo through the cemetery, each note a tribute to the love and loss that had shaped her life. As she played, she felt a gentle warmth settle over her, a feeling of love and comfort that made her heart swell. And in that moment, she knew that Daniel was still with her, that he would always be with her, just as Ben was. The music flowed through her, carrying her pain, her sorrow, and her hope, weaving them into a melody that resonated with the beauty of life and the bittersweet nature of loss. When she finished, she lowered her violin, her eyes filled with tears. She placed a hand on Ben's headstone, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Ben. Thank you for sending him to me, for giving me the strength to keep going." She took a deep breath, a small smile playing on her lips as she looked up at the sky, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. "And thank you, Daniel, for everything." As she rose to leave, she glanced back one last time, a feeling of peace settling over her. She didn't know where Daniel was, or if she would ever see him again, but she knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that he had been real, that their connection had been a gift, a reminder that love transcends even the boundaries of life and death. And as she walked away from the cemetery, she carried that love with her, a beacon of light that would guide her through the rest of her days, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. In the weeks that followed, Sarah shared her story with the townspeople, explaining that Daniel had been a friend, a companion who had helped her find peace. She spoke of him with reverence, her words painting a picture of a boy who had come into her life like a miracle, bringing her the closure she had longed for. Some people listened with skepticism, others with wonder, but all of them could see the transformation in her, the quiet strength that radiated from her like a healing balm. The townspeople began to embrace her story, seeing it as a testament to the power of love and the mysterious ways in which it connects us. They even started a small tradition, gathering in the cemetery each year to remember those they had lost, to honor the connections that never truly fade. And each year, as they gathered around Ben's grave, Sarah would play her violin, her music filling the air with a haunting beauty that seemed to reach beyond the veil, a melody that carried the memories of those they loved. As time passed, the legend of Daniel grew, becoming a cherished story in the town, a reminder of the unseen bonds that unite us all. And though Sarah eventually grew older, her story lived on, passed down through generations as a tale of love, loss, and the miraculous ways in which our loved ones find their way back to us, even when we least expect it. And in the quiet moments, when she was alone with her memories, Sarah would feel a gentle warmth, a familiar presence by her side. As the years went by, Sarah's life settled into a rhythm of quiet reflection and simple joys. She found herself becoming an almost revered figure in the small town, not so much for who she was, but for the remarkable story she carried. People regarded her as the woman who had lived through a mystery, a tale of love and loss that seemed woven with threads of something beyond the ordinary. And as time passed, the legend of Daniel and Ben grew, reshaping itself in the collective memory of the townspeople, each retelling colored by the listener's own sense of wonder or disbelief. Every year, on the anniversary of the day she first met Daniel, Sarah would return to the cemetery with her violin, a single red rose, and a candle she would place by Ben's grave. It became a personal ritual, a moment to honor the love she had shared with her son and the strange, beautiful connection she had found with Daniel. In the early years, townspeople would come with her, gathering around Ben's grave to hear her play, her violin's notes piercing the silence of the evening, each note carrying the weight of her memories. One particular year, a crowd of both familiar and new faces gathered at the cemetery, some there out of curiosity, others drawn by the hope of feeling a touch of the miraculous story they had heard growing up. The cemetery was dotted with candles, casting a warm, golden glow over the gravestones, the quiet hush of reverence blanketing the gathering. Sarah, now older, moved through the crowd, exchanging gentle smiles and hugs, greeting each person who had come to honor her son's memory. She felt a surge of gratitude for these people, for the way they had embraced her story, transforming it into something larger, something almost sacred in their eyes. When she reached Ben's grave, Sarah took a moment to look at the headstone, tracing her fingers over the familiar letters of his name. Her heart ached with that old, familiar pang of loss, but it was softened by the years, by the peace she had finally found. With a deep breath, she lifted her violin and began to play, letting the music flow through her with a grace that only came with years of experience and a heart full of both joy and sorrow. The crowd listened in silence, their faces turned toward her, each of them lost in their own memories, their own connections to those they had loved and lost. As she played, a sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, causing the candles to flicker and dance. Sarah paused for a moment, feeling a chill run down her spine, a familiar, comforting presence settling over her. It was as if Ben and Daniel were there with her, standing quietly by her side, listening to the music, sharing in this moment of remembrance. She closed her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her, her heart swelling with a sense of love that transcended time and space. When she finished, the crowd remained silent, each person seemingly caught in the magic of the moment. Slowly, they began to move forward, placing flowers, letters, and small mementos by the grave, gestures of love and remembrance for their own lost loved ones. It had become a tradition, this ritual of honoring those who had passed, inspired by Sarah's story, by the inexplicable mystery of her connection to Daniel. And as each person left their offering, they would touch Sarah's hand or offer her a kind word, expressing their gratitude for her courage, for her willingness to share her story with them. Over time, as Sarah grew older and her visits to the cemetery became less frequent, the townspeople continued the tradition. They gathered each year, bringing their own memories, their own griefs, and their own joys to Ben's grave, treating it as a sacred place, a symbol of hope and healing. Young children would listen wide-eyed as their parents retold the story of Sarah and Daniel, their voices filled with reverence and wonder, passing down the legend to a new generation. And in this way, Sarah's story, and the memory of her son, lived on, woven into the fabric of the town's history, a cherished piece of its identity. One year, a young boy approached Sarah's cottage, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked himself. He was no older than Ben had been when he passed, with bright eyes and a shy smile that reminded Sarah of her son. "Miss Sarah," he began hesitantly, "my mom told me about Ben and Daniel. She said you see them sometimes, like they're angels watching over you." Sarah's heart softened as she looked into the boy's eager face, seeing the innocent hope and wonder that only a child could possess. "Yes," she said gently, her voice filled with warmth. "I believe they're still with me in their own way. And sometimes, when I play my violin, I feel them close, as if they're listening, just like they used to." The boy's eyes lit up with a mixture of awe and understanding, and he looked down at the flowers in his hands. "I brought these for Ben and Daniel. I thought maybe they'd like them." With a smile, Sarah took the flowers, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "They would love them. I'm sure of it." The boy handed her the flowers, and together they walked to the cemetery, the path lined with trees whose leaves had begun to turn golden with the arrival of autumn. Sarah felt a warmth settle over her, a familiar presence that comforted her, as if Ben and Daniel were there, guiding her, reminding her that love never truly dies, that it simply transforms, taking on new shapes, new forms, but remaining constant, eternal. As they reached the grave, Sarah placed the flowers by Ben's headstone, her fingers lingering on the petals, soft and fragile. She closed her eyes, feeling the gentle weight of all the years, all the memories, and all the love that had shaped her life. She whispered a quiet prayer, a message to her son, and to Daniel, a thank you for the journey they had shared, for the lessons of love and loss that had taught her more than she could have ever imagined. When she opened her eyes, she looked around at the cemetery, at the candles, the flowers, the letters left by townspeople, all tokens of love and remembrance. She realized, in that moment, that her grief had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. Through her connection with Daniel, she had found a way to turn her sorrow into something beautiful, something lasting. Her pain had blossomed into a legacy of love, a story that had brought comfort and hope to countless others. In the years that followed, Sarah became a quiet, beloved figure in the town, often visited by people seeking her wisdom, her comfort, her stories. She would sit with them on her porch, sharing tea and memories, speaking of Ben and Daniel with a tenderness that never faded. She told her story over and over, never tiring of it, each retelling a tribute to the love that had shaped her life, a reminder that the bonds we share with those we love are never truly broken. One crisp autumn morning, many years later, Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep, a soft smile on her face, her spirit leaving with the same grace that had defined her life. The town mourned her deeply, feeling the loss of a woman who had become a symbol of resilience, of hope, of love that endures even in the face of unimaginable loss. Her funeral was held at the cemetery, near Ben's grave, and people came from miles around to pay their respects, to honor the woman who had touched their lives with her story, her strength, her grace. That evening, as the sun set over the cemetery, a small gathering took place around Ben's grave, where a violin had been placed, a single rose lying beside it. A soft breeze swept through the trees, and for a moment, the candles flickered, casting a warm golden glow over the gravestones. Those who stood there felt a quiet presence, a sense of peace that seemed to wrap around them, as if Sarah, Ben, and Daniel were there, watching over them, a trio bound together by love that transcended life and death. And in the years that followed, as new generations came to hear the story of Sarah and Daniel, the legend lived on, passed down like a cherished heirloom, a reminder that love is the most powerful force in the universe, a force that can bridge even the greatest distances, that can heal even the deepest wounds, that can endure even beyond the boundaries of time and space.